going to be looking at the Balios S, a mid-sized daily stroller from Cybex that launched last year. This is one of the most requested models that we've ever had on the channel, and before we start taking it apart piece by piece, I'd like to venture a guess as to why. My guess is that it has something to do with price. The Balios seems cheap. Not cheap, but cheap coming from a company that, in my opinion, has always tended towards overpricing their products, in particular their other mid-size model, the Priam, which is ridiculously, criminally expensive, especially now that they've thrown a hoverboard motor into the rear frame. The thing with the Priam, though, is that they haven't earned that price, not mechanically speaking anyway. They just made it up, right out of the blue. There was a reason for this, of course. You see, overpricing is, unfortunately, the only, or at least the quickest way to be taken seriously in the current stroller market. With the safety of our children at stake, customers are just way too quick to equate price with quality in this industry. So after a lackluster attempt at the mid-price market with a few other models, that's exactly what Cybex did with the Priam. They priced it as high as they could conceivably get away with, and pumped their considerable car seat wealth into marketing. And you know what? A lot of people bought into what they were selling. And you see, this leaves the Balios in a very unique position in my opinion, because the number one statement made in every review that I found on the Balios is that it's basically a Priam for 500 bucks. It is, by the way. If there's anybody watching who just wanted confirmation of this, mechanically the Balios is, other than a few structural differences with the folding mechanism and the rear frame, probably at least 70% Priam. But that's not the point, because as I said, they just made up the value of the Priam in the first place. So, with that rabbit in the hat illusion out of the way, we're going to look at the Balios as its own model. We'll take price into consideration, of course, but there won't be any extra credit given to the pricing decisions they've made with the Priam, because that would be letting ourselves get hoodwinked, right? Okay, good. Let's start off as usual with a few stats then. The Balios weighs in at 11.2 kilos and is 41 by 60 by 75 centimeters when folded. It can take up to 17 kilos in the seat and 5 kilos in the underslung shopping basket. We're going to get into the mechanics of this model in a moment, but before that, let's talk a bit about comfort, both for you and your child. As far as the seat is concerned, the size is decent, and it functions essentially like the Priam Lux seat, with a more or less full recline. I think it's slightly off 180 degrees, but not by much. An adjustable footrest, and a canopy with much better than average cover when extended. The canopy does hug the top of the seat, but this is offset by the length of the seat back itself, which is quite long, and even my 5-year-old fits in pretty comfortably under it. Fabric quality is somewhat subjective, but in my experience, the sort of fabric on the Balios is prone to easy scuffing and paint transfer, if you bump into walls, for example, and is also pretty susceptible to sun fading if you leave it outside a lot. On the other hand, the textiles are pretty easy to remove for a wash, and it's not even necessary to disconnect the safety belts to remove them, which is a nice thing. Though I do question the strength of some of the push buttons that they've used, and how well they'll hold up over time, at least if you're the type of user who will be washing the textiles often. The shopping basket is very middle of the road in all respects. Average size and weight capacity, not super easy to access with the seat attached, but doable. We're going to be dealing quite a bit with the folding mechanisms when we get to our mechanical run-through, but for here I'll say that when it's functioning as intended, as in right out of the box, it's pretty smooth. And for a certain type of lifestyle that requires a lot of regular folding and unfolding, like if you're the type of person who drives around all day, it's designed to be pretty handy. Cybex engineering is very much focused on trying to create a certain kind of user experience, in which there are as few steps as possible to achieve functional goals, and in which everything can be accomplished with one hand. On the Balios, they've taken the second idea, of one-hand use, to an obsessive extent, and the stroller sports 2 separate pairs of memory buttons, the first on the mechanism to remove the seat frame from the chassis, and the second on the footrest itself. So again, when it's functioning as intended, the Balios will feel pretty user-friendly to most people. As far as drivability is concerned, the Balios is a bit of a letdown for me. Design-wise, the incorporation of decent-sized wheels and good rear frame suspension would suggest better than average terrain capability for a stroller of this class. But unfortunately, these designs are ruined in execution by a variety of structural weaknesses, which will likely lead to a quickly deteriorating driving experience as key points loosen across the chassis. Okay, let's move on to the mechanics of the Balios, starting with the seat unit. As far as the seat unit is concerned, I just wanted to point out this thing about Cybex design philosophy, that they really want to emphasize ease of functionality for the user, but they do so at the expense of having a lot more internally complex parts that have a lot of small plastic bits and so on. So again, I mentioned that there were 2 sets of memory buttons, and of course memory buttons involve a whole extra set of internal parts to get it to kind of hook in so that you can move on to the other side than you would have with a regular button. In addition to this, on the seat unit, you of course have this very common trigger mechanism on the back for adjusting the seat. And you have a number of like safety locking points here. When you remove the seat unit, you can see it. And those prevent the seat from folding down because it has this like fold with the seat attached prevent you from being able to make that sort of a fold without the seat attached. And what happens anytime you have a lot of these sort of internal mechanisms that have a lot of parts is, of course, there's a lot more stuff that can go wrong. Now, there are other companies that do this, such as Bugaboo, that also have a lot of internal plastic parts. But Bugaboo as a company, when you take it apart, even though it has a lot of small plastic parts and things do go wrong, everything is fit together to the millimeter with like perfect precision. And I don't really find the same coming out of Balios. So for example, that trigger on the back that adjusts the seat, there's no top lip to catch that trigger so that you don't fold it too far. I've even gotten to the point where it's made rather unpleasant sounds here with the cracking at the top. And I notice that in general with their engineering, they are willing to do a lot of internal complex mechanisms, but the precision as far as how it's put together is a little bit loose, which just gives kind of more chance for potential problems and breaks in the future. Okay, moving on to the handle and the folding mechanism. It has this basic telescopic handle system, and then it has the folding mechanism here that is activated by pulling on a safety trigger and slamming this down inside, thus releasing this point here. Now there's a good thing and a bad thing about this. The good thing is that the only locking point is along this axis. The separate bar that runs down towards the back frame is just loosely hinged. So that means you have a relatively simple mechanism here keeping this bar in place. The negative side, and something that we've seen reported as having problems very often, is the amount of pressure that it takes in order to activate this mechanism, this slamming motion, which by the way is not entirely theirs. Is their design. I've seen similar mechanisms as long back as 15 years on Quinny strollers and stuff. But when you have this sort of slamming motion, you have a potential for doing quite a lot of wear where that activation mechanism is. And you can also wind up having the wear be sort of asymmetrical. And what we've seen reported is that over time, people have had trouble collapsing the stroller. And again, this stroller came out last year. So those kind of major mechanical issues, if people are already having trouble collapsing it, and it's not just one or two people, I've seen lots of reports online of people having problems with this. It means that it is a relative problem for this stroller. We're going to take a little bit of a closer look then at the lower rear frame of the Balios. First thing I wanted to point out is suspension. Right out of the box, this thing is going to feel like it's pretty well suspended. The lower bar here is more or less the same as the Pream, and it does actually have larger than the Pream suspension springs here. But the reason it's going to feel well suspended also has to do with these very thin bars here on the sides. The problem, though, is that even though it feels well suspended, the whole rear frame is held together with a number of weak points. First off, being those relatively thin bars, which can, of course, break. And because they're kind of thin, they can loosen both at the top and at the bottom. At the bottom, it is a screw, so it is tightenable. But still, in addition to that, and a little bit more seriously, is this stabilization bar that you see running here that's held together on both sides with rivets. The reason they have this is because the joint that holds the spring at the bottom here is made of plastic, and they don't want that to break, and also without it, it would feel too loose. As you can see, you can see how it moves, and this is what's going to feel like good suspension. But what's actually happening is that the key point of pressure is going to be on the two rivets here on either side of the stabilization bar, and when those rivets begin to loosen, the entire rear frame is going to feel really loose. And the bar itself is made of relatively thin metal, and it has a high chance of breaking. I know this because the Amalunga City Cross had the exact same setup on the front with the first few models, and that broke all the time. It was a continuous issue, and it was set up in exactly the same way with like the dual rivets on either side. So again, it's like they made a really good effort towards having this as a well-suspended stroller, but because it has so many weak points of connection, in the end, it's probably going to wind up being loose, or if you're like not too careful with it, breaking. I want to move down to the brake system. The brake system here in the middle is this flip-flop friendly on-off pedal. It's actually pretty simple as far as the system in the middle is concerned, but the part that worries me a little bit, and this is the same on the Pream, has to do with the pins that run into the wheels. So the pins themselves are not just made of metal, but they are surrounded by plastic. It's like a little metal pin with a plastic tubing around it. That plastic tubing has a potential for wearing down and for breaking. In addition, even from the outset, both on this model and actually the Pre-Am itself, I've noticed that the pins have a tendency to stick into the wheels at first. So that means like when you're first trying to take off the brakes, it can wind up sticking, and you can wind up doing extra damage simply as a result of that. Last thing on the rear frame would be the wheels themselves, the rear wheels, and just wanted to point out as like a last note that I do actually really do like Cybex's wheels. I like the quality of their rubber and their foam. I think it's going to hold out a lot better than a lot of other sorts of foam. Okay, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at the front frame then. I do like the larger than average front wheels for a mid-size stroller. That does help a little bit with driving up and over bumps. If you take out the wheel, the axle does have 2 points at which it's sort of held in relation to its like vertical connection inside the housing, one being the locking point at the top and the second being this lip at the bottom. Unfortunately, I would have liked to also have seen some kind of a spring-loaded pad, because when the wheel is in place, it's still not quite tight enough, even with those 2 points. It has regular suspension as you would normally see on the swivel wheel model. The swivel lock is a pretty standard design. It's just a pin that runs down into a trough in the top of the fork. It's very common. Sometimes it does run into problems where that trough can wear down, but generally it's kind of a commonly accepted standard for how you produce a swivel lock on the front end. The only part about the front end that really worries me, in addition to that axle still being a bit loose inside the housing, is if you look at this wheel here, as it is within the fork, it's quite loose. This is the case on both wheels, and this is right out of the box. And this is sort of the same thing as I was talking about when I was talking about the seat unit, which is that Cybex is not really careful enough when it comes to having their parts of their mechanisms fit very, very tightly together, like meticulously. And what happens is when you have the looseness there and you have the looseness there, like together, that's going to lead to a good amount of rattling and a good amount of like things not moving as precisely as they should, which is then in turn going to put pressure on other points on the chassis itself and of course on the front end, because all of those little jolts from that not being tight enough, it's like wear that affects these different mechanisms and these different points of connection. So when you combine that looseness then on the front wheels and the potential for a lot of loosening with the overall structure of the suspension on the back end, you wind up with a situation where I would say driving the stroller, if you're not careful to keep to flat terrain, even though it looks like it can handle something else, and keep within weight standards, and just anyway, after a few years, there's a lot of potential that it's going to get very loose and a little bit uncomfortable to drive. So, should you consider getting the Balios then? My initial reaction when pondering this question was to say no. It's simply not good enough, even at its current price point. But then I asked myself, if I can't recommend the Balios, what stroller would I recommend with comparable features? Lightweight, small to mid-size, with a reversible seat and 4 wheels with swivel front wheels, and that also clocks in at $500 or less. And you know what? I can't really think of a decent alternative. As dissatisfied as I am with several aspects of the Balios' engineering, I'd still put it above the Stock Beat, which is a lot weaker in construction, above the Baby Jogger City Premier, which is less user-friendly and less drivable, and also above the UPPaBY Cruise, whose arena of use is too limited due to its small wheel size and lack of suspension. These comparisons don't exactly add up to an endorsement of the Balios, of course. It's rather that the market for cheaper mid-size strollers with these characteristics is just pretty bad at the moment. Thus, if you're looking to go mid-size, what I would prefer to suggest first, before buying the Balios, would be to consider changing your personal requirements. You could go with a 3-wheel non-reversible seat and consider the Baby Jogger City Elite or the City Mini GT. You could spend a bit more and deal with something a few kilos heavier and go for Emelunga's extra sturdy NXT series. Or, if you are willing to spend a bit more, you could alternatively go for a Bugaboo Fox or wait for the Lynx, which looks pretty promising. The Balios is the 4th Cybex stroller that we've looked at, though we didn't actually do a review for the Eternus. And I've got to say that my opinion of their engineering has been pretty much the same across the board. Despite the shiny copper plumbing they stuck on the Pre-Am, their engineering is at best okay. And this is generally how I feel about most companies that build their designs the way Cybex does. You see, there are 2 chief ways that stroller manufacturers operate with regards to design. There are the innovators who do everything in-house, or at least almost everything, and build their strollers by themselves from the ground up, such as Bugaboo, UPPaBaby, Baby Jogger, Babyzen, Stock. And then there are companies that do only a few things themselves, mostly stylistic things. And then when it comes to the engineering, they just go shopping for pre-existing design patents, winding up with a hodgepodge of different ideas from different sources that, while they sometimes function okay, will never lead to the sort of mechanical elegance that can occasionally be achieved from entirely in-house designs, when everything comes together with just the right magic. In any case, we hope you found this video interesting. And if you did, we ask that you subscribe, as it helps us continue making videos in the future. Thank you.